listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up, and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want go to the ape believers saying, "Well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that."
And I look over my left shoulder, and this creature is running through the woods, and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. Happy May Day, everyone. We hope you're having a fantastic spring season and are as just excited as we are to get back out on the trail and search for evidence. I know many of you in the northern states, and certainly us here in the Pacific Northwest, are pretty excited to see the snow recede and the precipitation dissipate, which is perfect timing for us as we're bringing our two raffle winners, Michael Forsett and Guy Fortin from Oklahoma and Arkansas. They will be traveling up to the Pacific Northwest to go out on our Expedition 2019. And so it'll be really interesting to take two guys out from the Midwest and show them the Pacific and temperate rainforests here in the Olympics. So stay tuned. We'll have more to come on the other side of the expedition, and hopefully we get into some pretty decent areas. So for all the listeners out there, if you could grab your tablets, iPads, your laptop, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to Google. I want you to go to Tok, Alaska. That's T-O-K. That's where we're going to be starting tonight. With us on the podcast is Michael Thompson. He is the founder of SasquatchTracker.com, the Boreal Sasquatch. And Michael is one of the most northern researchers in North America and lives in some very dense wilderness surrounded by herds of caribou and moose and elk, and you name it, he's there. So Michael, welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. And if you wouldn't mind sharing your background for our listeners, really how you got into research and the phenomenon of Sasquatch.
Well, I was born in Illinois and moved to Idaho, mid-70s. Like every kid, I saved my allowance so I can go see movies, and that mid-70s when all the Bigfoot and Sasquatch type movies came out. I can remember seeing Sasquatch, The Legend of Bigfoot, in Boise, Idaho, and ever since that I thought, well, there's got to be something more to it. And then Boggy Creek, I saw that, and always thought, yeah, I'm on the right track. So I kind of got started at about 1974-ish, 75-ish, somewhere in there. Of course, living in Idaho, my father was a big Eagle Scout, so we did lots and lots of camping and things like that when I was growing up and hunting. So I had a lot of exposure to the outdoors. Went to college at the University of Idaho about 1985 or 86. I had planned to move to British Columbia to do full-time research. And, of course, not knowing what, everything entailed, understanding all about immigration procedures and things like that, I promptly was turned away from the border for lack of funds. I thought I could just show up and do it, but you got to have a little bit more of a working plan. I'm kind of glad that the Canadian officials refused me because my parents would have killed me because I would have had to drop out of college in order to do that. So, but I've been interested off and on for a number of years, and I finally made it up to Alaska. And I was reading a report that I think it was from the BFRO webpage. I want to say it was their webpage, the Matt Moneymaker one, about an incident that occurred about 15 miles from where I live. And I thought, oh boy, if this is happening within 15 miles of me that kind of renewed my interest. And so about 2004, I started looking into doing, research up here again. I kind of took a break in there from when I was turned back from British Columbia. I finished college and I was in the Coast Guard for a little bit, got married and things like that. So a little bit of time elapsed, and I thought, well, okay, I'm back up here and doing this, so I think I'll just renew my interest after seeing this one that occurred 15 minutes driving time from where I am. And in order to get the word out and to kind of get people aware of it that are in the area, I started the website. I think that was 2005 when I started the website.
So talk a little bit about your website, and just curious, did you have a chance to interview any of the local folks there that have had encounters?
No, it's somebody that traveled through on the Alaska Highway. And I was able to, just from their narrative on the other website, I was able to put together about where it happened. So I did go down there and did kind of a site investigation, or what I considered to be the site, after putting, their narrative together. And they talked about driving time instead of miles. And I thought, well, how fast would you drive if you were pulling a trailer? Because they were talking about towing something. And so talking to the actual person that reported it never happened. But once I got the website out and put a couple of letters to the editor type thing in the newspaper in Tok, people started to respond.
So, Michael, maybe just talk a little bit about, that encounter and kind of why it piqued your interest.
Well, the reason it piqued my interest is because it was a daytime sighting, and which is usually it's at night or dusk or dawn. Very rarely do we have daytime sightings. Sasquatch seems to be kind of nocturnal. And since then, that particular encounter, other people have contacted me, and all of their encounters have been nighttime. There was one during the afternoon, but 99% of them during the night. So that was a really interesting case there, because it happened during the day, around lunchtime, I think is what it said on their website.
So for the listeners that don't really know where you are, and I've, of course, asked them to go out in the intro there and pick you up on the map up there in Tok, but can you talk about Alaska in general and really kind of the terrain and geography where you're at?
Well, Alaska's pretty big. It's like 1/4 of the size of the lower 48. So down in southeast Alaska, it's kind of a rainforest and very moss-filled, big cedar forest and things like that. As you get into my area, it's more subarctic, and things are covered with moss. There's lots of bogs. There's birch trees and spruce trees. If you were to go to Google and type in boreal forest images, you would see kind of what I'm dealing with. The further north you go, then you're going to be out of the trees, but that's going to be way north of Fairbanks. So most of Alaska is covered with permafrost. So the water doesn't drain very well, so there's lots of bogs, and therefore the bogs create a good environment that can support other wildlife. There's spruce forests and the birch forests. They're good for building cabins and shelters and nests and things like that. So there's a lot of natural resources up here that would support a Sasquatch population. Temperatures could be minus 40 in the winter and 95 degrees above in the summer. Has got quite a range where I am. Southeast Alaska, like Juneau and Ketchikan area, seems to be a little bit more mild. Maybe 75 in the day, and in the winter it could be down to 20 degrees. I remember I lived down there for a little bit, and it would snow, and nobody owned a snow shovel because everything would melt off by noon the next day. So, and then you've got the Arctic where it stays pretty much winter for a good 8 months.
So, Michael, since you've lived up there in northern Alaska, just curious, have the winters been pretty consistent, pretty seasonal? Have you had some harsh ones? What do you recall in terms of just, how much variance there are in the seasons?
I don't really remember a harsh winter since 95 or 96 when they had the El Nino. They made such a big deal about that. I guess there's been a couple of El Ninos and La Ninas or whatever they are that have occurred in the last 20 years. But when I first got to this area, it would be 50 and 60 below for weeks at a time. You know, this last winter, it was maybe 45 below for 2 weeks. The rest of the time, it hovers around 15 to 20 below. And that's how, if you're from Florida or someplace like that, that sounds pretty bitter. But after you've been up here, you're acclimatized, and that's not so bad.
So, Michael, for the other researchers that are way out remotely, that, you know, you're away from population, can't do a town hall, can't do a gathering, can't find witnesses, it's too far to travel in Alaska to maybe another encounter, you might have to fly or take a plane, things like that. But talk about how you gather your own research there, and really what that experience is like, you know, interviewing eyewitnesses and holding events.
No town halls, because I'm an independent person. I'm just a one-man operation. Other people have contacted me for interviews and that sort of thing, but I haven't sponsored any meetings or lectures or anything like that. Yeah, that kind of thing, I'm sure it goes on up here, and other groups are doing it and things like that, but I'm 300 miles from Fairbanks and 420 from Anchorage, so I'm pretty remote. There's just not the population for that.
I think it's one of the more fascinating things about, you know, how remote it is where you live. You know, you probably have more bears than you have humans. Just talk a little bit about maybe the animals in the area and the bear population and kind of where you live.
There's enough bears where, in this particular area, you can shoot 3 black bears every year and 1 grizzly every year. So there's no shortage on bears. There's wolves and coyotes and lynx. You've got some seasonal migration with caribou and moose that come through. As far as small animals, you've got beaver and ermine and martins and things like that. Grouse. In the summer, there's quite a big duck population, duck and goose population. The local refuge brags that they produce at least 1 million ducklings and goslings. So.
Yeah, so thinking about, you know, just the prey-based wildlife up there, you know, deer, elk, caribou, and then, of course, the predators, you know, the mountain lions, the cougars, the wolves. What kind of, you know, territory are prey facing and predatorial animals there, kind of where you live?
Well, you got wolverines and coyotes and wolves that are going to take advantage of that. The occasional lynx. I would imagine there's a little bit of not so much the black bear because of the denning up in the winter, because the caribou that come through this area are in the winter. They usually arrive around Thanksgiving, and then they depart about the season up here. There's a subsistence season right where I am, and it's ending here in just like 10 days. So it's like the migration is a winter migration, and they go to their calving grounds, which are about 40 miles east of here in Yukon Territory. And I think there's a little bit of seasonal migration with Sasquatch that follows the local herd that comes through. Because why would there not be? There's got to be, you know, winters are harsh, even though I describe it, you know, as not being so harsh. But I'm living indoors and have electricity and you know, water and things. But somebody living outdoors, that would still be a harsh environment, harsh time of year. So following a caribou herd that's migrating through is definitely taking advantage of a food source, just like any other predator would be doing.
So, Michael, I think that there's published, you know, 40 caribou herds in Alaska that migrate, you know, beyond their home ranges, but, you know, stay kind of local. I was just curious, you know, how big of herds you've seen and, you know, what those populations look like and, you know, how dense they are for predatory animals like Sasquatch.
Yeah, and it's not always like you see on like a National Geographic type show where there's 40,000 of them that takes 3 days for them to walk through. They're usually in small groups of, you know, sometimes 2 up to about 8. It's kind of rare to see a big herd or big group like that because the area that I'm in is so vast. there could be 40,000 caribou, but you're only going to see 8 of them here and 5 of them over here because you've got a valley that's 50 miles wide. So you're not seeing things like that like you do on television shows.
So in terms of moose and elk and deer and other, prey-based wildlife, what do you have around there and what have you seen?
Not really deer because of the location, but lots of moose and the caribou. There's black-tailed deer, but there seem to be more in like Kodiak and on the coast and southeast Alaska.
So disregarding research, you're up there north, winter's just broke, the snow's starting to recede and you can get kind of back out in the field. But, when's the best time of year for, you to begin your research again and evidence collection? And what's that, break pattern look like in terms of snow and spring and, off into the summer?
It's breaking right now. The roads have been dry for a couple of weeks. The snow is receding fast in the sun. There's going to be pockets of deep snow in the shade where it's not being exposed to the light, of course. But within another month, it'll just be snow on the lakes, snow on the ice on the lakes. Because when it's this cold in the winter, the ice is usually about 3 to 4 feet thick, and that's always the last thing to melt, especially on the lakes. The creeks will break up before the lakes just because of the current underneath.
All right. So as we talked about kind of the area where you're at, maybe, for the listeners out there that have made it out to SasquatchTracker.com, which is Michael's website, can you talk a little bit about some of the Alaska files and some of the more interesting encounters or files you have out there on your website?
Well, at first I started listing these encounters as I would do other, research and talk to people. And it kind of got overwhelming very quickly. So I thought, how's the best way to do this? And I started to break it down by, there's one category that's just unknown. No date's been associated to it, or nobody's been able to come up with, to pinpoint when the event or incident actually happened. So that just has to be an unknown file. But when I started breaking these down by the decade, I noticed that there was a lot of historical things that were going on with the gold rush up to present, and it just made sense to break it down by decade, just to keep it organized.
Yeah, I really like the organizational aspect of it. And if you're out there and you're running a research program and you have a website, I always like to keep, and there's a lot of theories out there, but I like to keep a central database, at least in your area. You don't need to boil the ocean and find out what everybody else is doing. If you can just study in your area and keep a collective database on your research and share it at conferences like the International Bigfoot Conference and others, I think that would be most appropriate. So, Michael, I think you've done a really great job in doing that. The one other piece, I was just curious, because a lot of people say, submit an encounter or report a sighting, and they have a link on their website. I was just curious if yours is automated and does it upload directly to your database on your site, or do you have to manually do that?
That's just a contact form. Somebody fills that out, it sends me an email with the information that's on the form. And there's always a contact email, and some people slip a phone number in there. And I just contact the person when they submit it. It doesn't automatically post to the website. Once I get their information and contact them, I go through an interview process. The interview process, I ask all kinds of things like the time of day, the season, the weather conditions. I'm trying to get all these things, all these facts sorted out. And then we talk about the encounter and how long it lasted, and then things after the encounter. Was there a strange smell? Did they find tracks that are associated with what happened? We talk about the other witnesses and things like that. So once I compile all that data, sometimes I can write the report rather easily, and sometimes I have to do a few follow-up contacts for clarification. Once I get that, I have a master file with the complete information and everything. Privacy is a big deal to me, so I don't release anybody's name without their permission first. And so I have to edit these things when they talk about, well, my friend Bob and my brother Jim or things like this. So I have to cut those things out. So once I edit it for privacy, sometimes I have to edit it for content as well. So you're getting kind of a paraphrased little kind of snippet of the actual encounter when the report could be 3 or 4 pages typewritten long, but you're only seeing a couple of paragraphs on the database. I just can't put everything on there.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think that a lot of other researchers out there that are, kind of building their collection database. I mean, it's everything from stickies to paper notes to websites to email. But I think that the most important thing is to get your data collection form together. And then, of course, make sure it's consistent. So I really appreciate that. And I think it's some sage advice there for other researchers. So, Michael, the other thing that I thought you shared that is really great, a lot of researchers always press for somebody, come on the radio show, come on the podcast, come out, speak your eyewitness encounter and things. But a lot of times, some of the best information is from anonymous, eyewitnesses. And so I was just curious, do you find that the best approach to, take an eyewitness report anonymous and kind of disarm them so they're not worried about, what they're going to be thought of? Just curious your thoughts.
Being ridiculed is part of the thing. It seems that a lot of people have very good encounters and very good information to share, but they're afraid because they're ridiculed. And that's part of the business. Even as a researcher, I get ridiculed a lot. People tell me I'm wasting my time and things like this, but that's part of the thing. You got to kind of develop a thick skin. And so, if you're going to be a researcher and do your own research, you have to take into account that if you're being ridiculed, your witness is being ridiculed or has the potential to be ridiculed by his or her peers. And so you got to go into it, to build this trust. When you build the trust, that's when you get the person that you're interviewing to open up. Not always, but, if you come across as the calm and you explain your feelings and things like this to them, they'll open up to you. It's just kind of an interviewing technique.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that you interview everyone. And I would, recommend that for anybody out there doing research, interview everybody, including the people that want to remain anonymous. A lot of times you'll find some of the best information, comes from those sources. And where you might think, it's just a story or a white fib and those types of things. It's still good to collect the data and triangulate it versus all the other data you've collected in the area to see if there's any correlation, timing, spottings, migration patterns, all those types of things. I know a lot of times too, people want, myself and other podcasters to ask, do you have experience in the outdoors? Do you know the difference between a bear and a lion and a cougar and a wolf? All those types of things. But, some of the best encounters often also come to people with just not really any knowledge of the outside. So I really appreciate kind of how your website talks about that as well. And some of the encounters you've had where, the witness was just, average Joe Blow out on a drive. So it's all good stuff.
I found a lot of people that I interview don't really have outdoor experience. Alaska is this great destination for lots of people, and I've saved my whole lifetime to make this trip. And then they come up here, and in the summer is the big tourist season. So it's light around the clock because of the midnight sun, and people are not from this area, so they're used to going to bed at 10 p.m. or something like that, and it's really midnight and it's still light out. They're not some people take medicine and I take my pill every day at 4 p.m. Sir, it's 10:30. You haven't had your medicine, and they have to cram a lifetime trip into 10 days to 2 weeks. So there's a lot of they're fatigued, they're dehydrated, they're not on their schedules, and so a lot of things that could be weeded out or explained, like they're looking at a moose walking away from them, they immediately think it's a Sasquatch when there's a reasonable explanation to it. It's just that their mental and physical condition. I found that just through the interviewing with the questions and things like that. That was one of the big things was when people from outside of Alaska contact me. I had to ask, what were you doing before this happened? Were you on a tour group, and where were you, and that kind of a thing.
So, Michael, out on your website, you also talk a little bit too about, Sasquatch tracking gear. And I thought it was really well laid out. But, for the novice hiker or backpacker, you're in Alaska, you're not expecting anything related to Sasquatch. You're just out having a good time, experiencing the outdoors and everything we see on TV. But, at the same time, you always want to be prepared. And, for the researchers, we typically have a field kit and other things we're carrying. But, Just curious if you could talk a little bit about what you believe needs to go into that for the novice researcher and kind of what your thoughts are on tracking equipment.
Well, the tracking gear, a lot of people contacted me through my blog and through email asking about, well, I was going to do this and I didn't have this, but what if I would have had this? And I thought, there's a definite need to put some kind of a kit together. And so that's the evidence collection kit came about because of the people were talking about so much about, they wish they had something small that they could take with them that would fit in a backpack with their fishing gear and that kind of a thing. So that kind of came about, there's a desire to have it, so I'm filling a niche. The other tracking gear, a lot of my stuff is not specialized. It's just, I talk about what camera I use and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to get people out there to, taking a picture with a cell phone is not the best option, but when there's a camera available, but anymore I think the cell phones are getting as good as the cameras. But just to kind of demonstrate that, you can use everyday household things that people don't normally associate with collecting evidence. That was my motive behind that, just to give a gear list of what I'm doing.
So, Michael, one of the things you also talk about on your website is track preservation. And I think that this is really important. And really, and we've talked about this on a few podcasts, even going back to last season. But, once you pour that first impression, and you pour your casting material, that impression is never the same. And so, practice makes perfect. I always, recommend before you, cast your first print that, you're doing some of this. It was an absolute disaster when I first started, but talk a little bit about some of your techniques and some of the things you think that are important for other researchers out there.
Well, I have a background in archaeology, and so when you go to dig something, you've got to take some very precise field notes and measurements and things like this, because once you uncover an artifact, you can't put it back into that environment, cover it back up with dirt so somebody else can find it the same way. I mean, it's just, that came about because of my archaeology experience, that you've got to do everything that you can to preserve this information, like you said, because once you start mixing your casting material, it's over. It'll never be like that ever again. You're preserving the evidence, but you're also at the same time destroying the original of the evidence, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for the novices too, it's not just casting the print, but the material you're working with and being sure you're consistent about that too. And exactly, what you're doing. But so, practice. It makes perfect.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. The practice leads to ability leads to confidence. That's, how I look at it. So the more you do it, the better off you're going to be.
So speaking of trackways, out on the Sasquatch Tracker website, you've got a lot of, different casts and impressions, and I found it very fascinating. But maybe you might want to share a little bit about some of those that you've found or archived, and really what you know about those.
Well, first of all, I think that by far that the track evidence is the biggest group of evidence, or best type of evidence that we have. We have lots and lots of videos, but the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot always appears grainy, or it's out of focus, or it's at night and the lighting isn't right. People record howls and things like that, but there's always so much tremendous, amounts of background noise that it's hard to tell what you're hearing or listening to. And so by far, preserving a track or finding a track, that's the biggest group of evidence, largest base of evidence. And so I found lots of tracks here locally and around in my area. And I guess I lost my train of thought there for a second. I found lots of tracks in my area, and I do my own photography. There's a lot of those things on my website that are credited to Michael Thompson. He's my oldest son. He works for me. So, and some of the things that I do see have been submitted by other people. They'll send it to me as an attachment by email. One thing I do when I'm looking at pictures of tracks is I do a photograph authentication process. I'll look at the angle of the shadows and make sure that they line up, so make sure that something's not been photoshopped in there. I'm not like a forensic type of a person, but I can, when you look at how the shadows line up and things like that, you can pick up on anomalies if they've been inserted in there. A lot of the tracks that I find, they start in the middle of nowhere and they end in the middle of nowhere. I follow tracks for hundreds of yards and then had them end next to tire tracks, so it's like those were definite hoaxes. Because even the best hoaxes have to end and begin someplace. A lot of tracks, they look like they've been stamped into the earth, like somebody wearing plywood cutouts on their feet. People, you should be able to pick up on that. They look like cookie cutter type tracks. And then the other tracks, I have no explanation for them because they're the way that the mid-tarsal break is rolling on the sand or on the moss or something is looking pretty good. I always write those off as being very authentic.
So, Mike, let's just talk about, some of the remote, experiences that I know you've had. I know Paul and I have had. I know many people listening to the show have had. But, talk about, the odds, too. You're out there in a remote area of Alaska. Even if you told somebody where you're going, the odds are you're not going to run into anybody or they're not going to take the time to get where you're going to get to hoax you. So can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences and then, of course, some of the weird anomalies that have happened to you out in the woods?
Yeah, I've been places where I didn't tell anybody where I was going and found tracks. So I know that the chance of somebody hoaxing me in that position or in that location are just, they don't exist because I didn't tell anybody I was going to be there. I've had the feeling of being stalked or watched. I've done a couple of verbal, whoops, and then had response. So that's always a little bit unnerving. And I haven't actually seen anything, an actual creature or being, but track evidence and then hearing the things respond to me. Done some tree knocking and had them response and different response on both sides of me, and I felt like I was being trapped or stalked on that one, definitely. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that, even after doing this for 30 plus years, I still get a little bit, maybe I shouldn't be doing this kind of a feeling. And sometimes it's exciting, and sometimes it's just downright scary, especially in the dark. When you can't see anything, that's when it gets the scariest or spookiest.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself. And what's kind of funny is, I always envision, okay, everything's in the same place it was during the day. Don't be frightened. But of course, it's just a different environment at night. So, for those that are out there and you're clear out, your mind starts getting the better of you. I'm pretty far away. I'm not sure what's in the trees. I'm hearing noise. There's a lot going on out there. So again, certainly understand the paranoia and of course the just anxiety that builds there in the dark. Michael, of course, you come from an archaeological background. Just curious, on what your thoughts are on why we don't have more fossil evidence or skeletal remains. Just thought you might want to share that in your views on that for the audience.
Well, I think that from the archaeological point of view, I think there's a lot of bones in a lot of museums that have been misidentified. You've got people that find skeletons and things like this, and the incomplete skeletons, and so they identify this as a femur bone from a man that lived 200 years ago or some odd thing like that. But I think that some of these things are misidentified, so it's quite possible that at least partial skeletons of Sasquatches or Bigfoots exist in museums and collections right now. This is an animal that's, keen in its environment. It's the apex, predator and scavenger, and it surely knows how to be evasive. That's kind of what they do. And then there's other people that have ongoing physical encounters that have the evidence, but, back to our thing about being ridiculed, they won't share it. So as far as what we should be doing or why we haven't found anything, I think that this is like the best time in history that we're in right now to be able to find things, because you've got all these drones that people buy, on Amazon, and and use, their gift cards from Best Buy to get things like this. So you've got lots and lots of technology out there now, and this is going to increase, the chances of an encounter with some evidence to it. Sooner or later, a logger is going to run over, a Sasquatch on a back road with, a load of load of logs or something like that. It happens about, people kill a Sasquatch. I think I read it someplace that an average of every 4 years, one is killed. But because the way things are in this world, politically and scientifically, the people are afraid to do or to say anything, because if it's tested and too much like a person, then they've committed a homicide if they kill it, or a murder. And then if it's not, they don't want to take the chance of the ridicule. This is really ended up being a bear or something like that. You misidentified it. You don't know anything. You're silly and stupid. And so there's always that kind of a thing. I think awareness is a big key, making people aware. And, that you've got a lot of commercial images, like your Jack Link's messing with Sasquatch. And Harry and the Hendersons was another one that everybody kind of has this image of this is the way Bigfoot's supposed to be or look. And so when they see something that's not matching the description, it's not getting reported because they feel like they haven't seen what they were supposed to see. Like there's a little bit of hesitation there to say something. I found that through interviewing also.
Yeah, I definitely believe it is the apex predator out there in the forest. Now, where it comes from and what it is, that's a whole different topic. But just curious on the use of technology. You've got this creature that is the apex, so to speak, and it's got a better heightened sense of awareness and senses than we would as humans. Do you think technology really can out-gadget this creature? And what do you think the use of, the new technology brings? And are there any hopes for technology in future study?
Not just the newer technology, but the availability of it. Everybody's got this kind of a thing now available in a cell phone, some kind of a camera or something with them. Now, 10 years ago, people had cameras and people had phones. Now everybody's got these things combined in these little miniature iPad and iPod type phones. And so the availability definitely is going to help us out with that one.
Yeah, for sure. And to the availability, we did a test recently here at a conference, and someone was giving us a hard time, why, with all these cell phones, can no one get a clear image of Sasquatch? So the guy's standing there, I'm chatting with him. Paul kind of walks around the corner, and I said, okay, so we're going to do a test. Are you ready? He says, yes. And I said, okay, there's a Sasquatch over your shoulder, and he's going to be out of sight in 10 seconds. Grab your camera and get a picture. So the guy reaches in his wallet, he grabs his phone, he pulls it up, he's fumbling it around, and then it's an iPhone 10. So he's got to pull it up to his face, get his facial recognition, scroll over to his camera. He got a text in the middle. By then, Paul's clear on the other side of the convention center. So I just think it's funny to all those out there that say, oh, well, there's cameras and camera traps everywhere. Again, fly from Seattle to Alaska and tell me there's camera traps everywhere. There's just not, but I just think it's funny.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example. It needs to be in your hand and running in order to capture an image. You don't have time to fumble around to hit the power button and get it focused. It has to be ready to go before the event happens. Same with like recording. If you do a couple of whoops, don't wait for something to respond before you hit the record button. You need to be recording the whole time that you're, doing some calls, because you'll miss the response, the operator error.
So, Michael, have you, of course, done any of the chest strap GoPros or helmet cams? Have you tried any of that?
Nothing like that. We've done multiple game cameras in multiple different locations, have things that have tripped it, but then, kind of like what you see on TV here is this blur. And most of the time, we write that off as being a raven or another bird that's flown in front of the camera. I considered that because of night vision possibilities that a Sasquatch has, that it's able to see these little cameras and things at dusk and at night. So we thought about putting cameras up high being like telephone pole high, and aim down at a trail just to avoid detection. But of course, then you got to climb a tree, and I'm not really keen on doing that. These trees around here aren't big enough to support weight of a grown man. I'm not going to lug, scaffolding out there just to do this, because then I'm disturbing the site, making it obvious that I put something. So it's kind of a hit and miss on that thing. That lots of pictures that aren't, they just like everybody else, they're grainy and hard to tell what it is.
Well, Paul and I, at least, we're going to try more of the chest cam approach this year, and I've seen other researchers trying that as well, but haven't tested the batteries so much, but certainly we'll run, multiple on hikes and trail loops and such. So hopefully it's a good technique, and I'd be interested to hear, how other researchers are dealing, with the longevity of the trip and the battery life and how many cameras they're collecting and things like that. But maybe we'll get some more of that information out this season.
You ever try any dashboard cameras on vehicles or anything like that?
We have, but we went a little bit lower in than we probably should have. I drive a Toyota Tundra. Paul drives a Dodge Ram. And, of course, we have dash cams, but they only record the last 30 minutes. But we do keep our audio clips on when we open the doors and, of course, on the vehicles and things like that. But, we certainly need to have more on the vehicles, when we go out. And certainly that's our intent this season. So if there's other researchers out there that have some good ideas on truck setups or vehicle setups, I'd certainly love to have you on the show so you can kind of share what you did. I think it'd be really great for everybody to hear.
Yeah, the more the better, but then you're talking thousands of dollars.
Right, yeah.
People like to wear clothes and eat food and live in houses,
Well, I know Paul and I were looking out on Amazon too, and you don't have to go GoPro anymore. Most of the 4K cameras are pretty good. The Z and some of the other stuff from China, who knows? It might be good. And of course, most Sasquatch research for out there listening, that if you're not doing research, most of this is on our backs financially. And so all the researchers you hear on any podcast, radio show, a lot of that's self-funded. And so, we certainly appreciate all the contributions and everything, but it is self-funded, and so it can be expensive. So again, if there's other researchers out there, you've got great tips on gear or equipment that you think is, reasonably priced, give us a shout, contact us. You can hit me up, Chuck at SasquatchSyndicate.com. But again, I'd like to get that information out this season if possible. The other thing I was just going to mention too is, with the dash cams, and we went pretty low end. I didn't mention, but we had pulled some, the as seen on TV off the Walgreens shelves, put them on the vehicle. And again, they only record the last 30 minutes. But that's okay. Like I said, you're pulling into an area and, maybe you're not that far off, the beaten path. So, if you don't have a GoPro, sometimes that's a good option.
Yeah, well, and that's the purpose of it. If they're in an accident, it's supposed to catch you hitting something, or somebody running into you. It's not supposed to,
archive your whole day.
It makes that continuous. Yeah.
So, Michael, of course, this is going to hit a lot of folks there in Alaska and in the northern states here in North America and Canada. Just curious, for the folks in that area around BC, of course, Alberta up into Alaska, close to your area. If someone wanted to report a sighting, can you just share, of course, your website and how to best to get a hold of you?
Well, I got a contact form on the main website, SasquatchTracker.com. I also have the contact through my blog, which is SasquatchTracker.wordpress.com. I can be contacted through there as well. Phone numbers, I believe, is on the website. I keep hours between 10 and 3, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. My real-life job, my shifts vary, so a lot of times it's hard to reach me. So if you call between those hours and there's no answer, just leave a message, and I will definitely return the call. By far, the best way to contact me is through the website, though, by email, because I have access to that 24 hours a day. And then if you leave a good email, I can always contact you back, and then we can set up a time to talk.
Michael, I know that you said that, it's hard sometimes to meet face-to-face just because of how large the geography is and where you live. But, for those that you can't meet face-to-face, can you talk a little bit about just kind of what your approach would be?
Well, it's hard for me to conduct on-site visits a lot of times because of the distance involved, and, the getting there, usually involves a plane ticket and things like that a lot of times. But I do contact people by email all over Alaska. I do have a couple of people that are trusted individuals. I call them Sasquatch Tracker Associates that do the legwork for me in certain areas where when they have an encounter in their area, I'll put them on it. Then they kind of report back to me.
Yeah, and I know for the local folks there, especially in Alaska, where we can get more boots on the ground and more people out investigating, maybe you can share a little bit about, well, I guess they don't have to contact you just on encounters. You've got a lot of great information on your website, but I know you're a pretty good resource of information as well there, and a good resource library to hit up and pick your brain, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm game for anything. If people have research questions, I'd be happy and willing to share what I can. Not just Sasquatch things, but if you have a question, a biological question about hair sample or something like that, I would be happy to help with that as much as I can. So anything Sasquatch related or outside related in research areas, I'm more than happy to field questions on those.
All right. Well, Michael, this has been a fantastic hour. We appreciate you coming on, sharing your insight and kind of where you're located and kind of what you guys have going on up there in Alaska.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
This concludes our May 2019 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Saturday, June 1st. Thanks to all of our listeners and those that have been out to our website and those following us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject. So for all the believers and disbelievers and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.